everybody. I'm coming to you from the pumpkin patch. I thought this was cute. It's October. So, when the section meets in the spring, you'll probably wonder why I'm in all the pumpkins. But Halloween is coming up, so I thought I'd do the pumpkin patch now. Well, we're here to talk about nutrition and digestion. That's kind of appropriate with Halloween approaching. Hopefully, some people will be able to go out and get some candy. Alrighty. Um, but yeah, so we're here to talk about nutrition and digestion and learn about the evolution of digestion systems throughout the kingdom Animalia. And one thing to remember when we were speaking about animals is that they are heterotrophic, right? So they have to bring nutrients into the body. And when they do that, they're doing that so that they can use those molecules in order to supply each cell with the necessary what is necessary to build cellular structures and to make energy. So that's the whole point of being heterotrophic. And so you need to obtain those nutrients from an outside source. And sometimes the outside source, we need to modify that molecule into smaller molecules. And so that's the digestion part. All right. Oops. I can advance the slide. Whoa, I'm the great pumpkin in the pumpkin patch. Sorry. What's interesting about animals is they all require basically the same nutrients, and I can blow this up for you so you can see a little bit better. So we all need carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. These are the building blocks of cellular structures and things like that. We need vitamins and minerals, and so these are things that kind of support those structures and help with the process of creating these things. So again, we may ingest food like a carbohydrate, and a carbohydrate can be a very long molecule called a polysaccharide. Poly means many, so it's usually many molecules of something like glucose strung together. So that structures, you can see there, where do our carbohydrates come from? Usually from grains, sugars, that kind of thing. And so when we ingest that food is too big to cross our cell membranes and feed our cells, right? So the process of digestion, we will break down those polysaccharides into their individual molecules called monomers, which are the monosaccharides, and that is things like glucose and fructose, that type of structure. Okay. We also need lipids in our diet, the fats that helps to make cell membranes and organelle membranes, other things like that. And so again, when we ingest fats, you can see oils and butters, that kind of thing. We ingest the triglycerides, and again, those are very large molecules. So we need to digest that down into the fatty acids, and then those can get into our cells. And our cells can actually recreate the triglyceride again. Proteins are very large molecules, very complex molecules that, again, can't cross the cell membrane. Their structure we can refer to as a polypeptide, because polypeptides are string of amino acids that are bonded together through peptide bonds. So you have many peptide bonds, so that's poly. Poly means many. So we want to, once we eat the protein, you can see that's normally in meat, where we normally get proteins. Plant material can have protein as well, but it's a little bit different structure. However, what we're doing is we're breaking that down into the individual amino acids, and it's the amino acids then that we can put into our bloodstream and absorb that into our individual cells. So what we'll see when we get into the digestive system, that in order to digest these different products, we need different enzymes to do that. We have enzymes that are specific to carbohydrates, specific to lipids, and specific to proteins. And even within carbohydrates, we have enzymes that are specific to different types of carbohydrates. So we have to have an enzyme to be able to chemically digest these nutrients. into their monomers, into their simplest parts. And if we don't have the enzyme for it, we simply can't digest it, and it just becomes a waste product for us. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we head through. But before we do, so I mentioned that all animals have very similar dietary requirements. Um, and even though we'll see in the last unit that there is an immense diversity in animalia, all the different species that we have, but out of all of that diversity, there are only three main dietary categories, right? And so you can either be an omnivore, a carnivore, or an herbivore, right? So um, herbivores, of course, eat only plant material. Carnivores eat only meat, animal products, or other animals. And omnivores can eat a combination of that, right? And really, omnivore and carnivores have a similar digestive tract, and herbivores can have a different digestive tract. And that's just because there are different needs for processing plants and meat. We'll see a little bit about that later when we get into the actual digestive structures. Okay, and there is more nutrition available in meat. And so normally carnivores and omnivores don't need to eat as much. Herbivores, because of this, tend to usually eat continuously. And so that way they can obtain all the nutrition that they need. Okay. But so being in a category of omnivore, carnivore, or herbivore, we'll see different adaptations to be able to obtain these different types of food, right? And so that's what we'll look at next, is some of the adaptations. Remember though that there are some adaptations really restrict an animal into what type of food they can go after, but others, so other animals might have a little more might be able to switch their feeding strategies depending on this changing environment, so they're not restricted to just one type of food. So we call those, they're opportunistic, or they're generalists, so they're able to switch around. And then even we'll see as we look at different animals, when we look at adaptations in animalia later in the semester, we'll see that even some animals actually end up eating differently during different life stages. So think of like butterflies and moths. Well, they start life out as caterpillars. So caterpillars will eat plant material, the leaves and things, while butterflies and moths may suck on the nectar from the flower. Now, think of frogs and tadpoles, right? When they start out life as a tadpole, they're also herbivorous. They eat the algae and plant material in the pond. But frogs become carnivores, and so they are able to eat insects, things like that. So there are some switching and strategies. But let's look at some of the adaptations for obtaining food. So some of the adaptations, they're going to develop different appendages, different mouth parts, depending on the animal, in order to obtain food. So here's some pictures of some jellyfish. The one in the blue on the right is a big Portuguese man-o-war. And so in order to get food that floats or swims, they may be able to grow these long tentacles that can trap fish and other organisms inside their tentacles, and then through that contractive motion bringing it up to their gastrovascular cavity, right? So they don't have to do a lot of movement. They kind of just float there and allow the tentacles to do the work, and have something just kind of swim right into it. Think of Finding Nemo and Dory having to swim through all of those jellyfish. She didn't want to get caught in the tentacles, right? When we see vertebrates, many of them have different types of teeth in order to capture food, right? And so we'll see a different, depending on whether they're carnivore, herbivore, or omnivore, we'll actually see a different classification of teeth that they have, and different sizes of teeth. So herbivores You can see in the picture in the skull over to the right, and it's all the way over to the right. They tend to have really large, flat molars. You can see that toward the bottom of the skull. Very large, flat molars. That's used for crushing thick plant material and grinding it down. It might have incisors in the front teeth to be able to pick leaves or pick pieces of grass, right? Some herbivores, like goats, they don't actually even have incisors on their upper jaw, and that's what this one is showing here. They do have incisors on their lower jaw, but animals like herbivores, like horses and things, they might have incisors on both the upper and lower jaw. Okay, and you can see that at all of those four animals that are smiling. That looks like a horse, the herbivore that they have there. Also, canines may be, you'll see a difference in canines between carnivores and herbivores and omnivores. So true carnivores usually have very long, sharp, sometimes canines, and they're used for tearing, grabbing at prey and tearing flesh. They're not really used for chewing. The jagged molars are also very sharp, usually more pointed rather than flat like we see in the herbivores. And so again, with sharp, even molars, they're not well adapted for chewing. And so it's more for tearing flesh. And so normally animals like tigers and things, they'll actually end up swallowing large chunks of food. And we believe that this strategy evolved due to competition. So you may catch prey and bring it down and kill it, and you have something to eat, but another predator can come and chase you off. So the more flesh you can chew and swallow and get into your stomach and then run off, the better off you are. So then we'll see that the adaptations in digestion allows for the capture of large food pieces, food chunks, so that we can digest it down into smaller molecules later. Right? And then omnivores have a combination of grinding molars and sharp canines for vegetation. And here you can kind of shows the difference between A is I think that's a wolf that they're showing there. And you can see the incisors and the canines, the sharp premolars and the sharp molars, right? All the teeth tend to be sharp. And then at B there, that looks like the skull of a horse, and you can see the very flat molars and the flat premolars. Again, more adapted to grinding tough plant material. Remember, plants have cellulose in their cell membranes, and they have lignin and other things like that. That makes it very tough to chew. So large flat molars help with that grinding to grind it down. You can see the incisors, little kind of stick out a little to help pick off delicate leaves, blades of grass, that kind of thing. And this herbivore has a lower canine. There's no upper canine. And that canine may not really even be used much for feeding. It might be used for or display to another individual. So most herbivores have actually lost their canines, and those that have them are actually more for display when they're keeping competitors out of the way. And then notice the omnivore, and the human is the example there. It's adapted for chewing a variety of foods, being able to chew plant and meat material. Okay, so able to have a more wide variety of foods. But we're going to see, depending on the type of food they can capture, then that's going to influence the evolution of the structure of the digestive system as well. Because different foods, it's harder to digest in different ways. There's also suspension feeders. So these are also feeding in the water column, but they're going after much smaller pieces of food. And so they use filter feeding in order to suck water in And you can see the mollusk has several cilia, little microscopic stringy materials. It's actually part of the cell membranes that water can kind of be pushed through there like a sieve, and the food particles get stuck on the cilia, and the cilia then kind of wave and put it toward the cell membranes, and that can be absorbed right into the cells. Baleen whales have a similar structure, but instead of microscopic, it's macroscopic. They use plates of keratin. Keratin is the same material that makes up your fingernails. So you can imagine these long plates that hang down from their upper jaw. And the outer edge, you can see water gets sucked in and it flows through the spaces in between the plates. And then on the inside, though, of the baleen, it's very fringed. It's all smaller pieces. It almost looks like the cilia on top there, but it's not that small. But that then forms like a brush-like area to capture smaller food items like krill, even sometimes small fish, depending on the type of baleen whale, and it would depend on the type of baleen that they have. This all is used for feeding suspensions feeders, things that are floating around in the water column. But they have to have a means of sucking water in. So you can see in the clam there, they have two siphons for water to come in and out. A whale can suck water in using the muscles of their mouth and their throat to do that. Some animals are fluid feeders, right? And they have a variety of mouth parts. So, oh, actually, I'm sorry. I spoke too soon. That's for the next slide. I was looking down. I can see the next slide coming up. I was looking at that one. Let me continue on. So animals that are called grazers, these are herbivores that feed constantly on grasses, like you can see the sheep there. And there's more categories. Browsers are herbivores that eat up in the bushes or in the trees, so they eat the leaves and things off of bushes and trees, like goats do that. The giraffe do that, if you remember that back to the early work we did with niche partitioning, when you looked at those videos. Those that specialize at just eating fruit are called frugivores. So this is a bat that specializes in eating fruit. So it's going to have mouth parts to help it kind of suck the fluid from the fruit and get the fleshy part of the fruit as well. So it's usually a nice long rasping tongue that can do that. Okay, here's the fluid feeders. So fluid feeders can either lick at fluid or suck the fluid from plants or animals. So think in terms of like a mosquito. They have a long proboscis that can pierce your skin and suck the fluid out of there. Here's a leech in the picture here. This also has the ability to pierce the skin with their teeth, and then they actually secrete a local anesthetic, so you kind of don't feel what's going on, and then they secrete an enzyme that helps to break down the flesh, and then a chemical enters to keep the blood vessels open so they don't coagulate, so it makes it much easier for the leech to pull fluid out. And then below is a hummingbird, a fluid feeder. So again, it has a beak that's elongated with an elongated tongue, so it can get the nectar out of a deep flower tube, right? So think of all the different adaptations and all the different animals that you've seen so far. So while we all have the same basic nutritional requirements, again, with this diversity, we see a wide range of different ways of capturing the food that we need or obtaining the food that we need. Okay, so let's go back. Remember that we started everything with single-celled organisms. And so we learned that it's our single-celled organisms that kind of started this whole thing with, again, for a cell to be alive, it has to be able to create structures inside of its cells and to obtain energy. So heterotrophic organisms do that by eating other things, right? And so I gave you A couple of examples of single-celled protists here. In the bottom left corner is the amoeba, who is capturing, that's actually a paramecium it's capturing there. And its cell membranes, its body, the cell body is wrapping around the paramecium, and the cell membranes of the amoeba will merge, and then that paramecium will be inside of the amoeba itself. So it's a bigger particle, the amoeba or the paramecium. And so within the amoeba, it has digestive enzymes that can break down that organism within its cell body, within its own body. And then the cell itself has obtained the nutrients that it needs. In the upper right corner is a drawing of a paramecium. And again, it's showing you the oral groove where it's able to, it has cilia that can create a current that pulls food particles into the cell. And once it's within the cell, then again, within those vacuoles, there are enzymes that can help further process the food for that single-celled individual. But the cell is bringing the food inside of its body, and now and once it breaks it down, it has obtained the nutrients that it needs, right? So again, single-celled organism bringing the nutrients right into the cell. So then when we saw multicellular organisms, remember, each individual cell also needs those nutrients, and so they have a distribution problem. When you're multicellular, how do you get the nutrients into your body and distributed to every single cell in your body? So remember, the solution, and we're seeing this trend, is to create organs that can ingest the food and process the food down to its individual parts. So organs will do that individually and working cooperatively within an organ system. And then that way, once the nutrients are broken down into their monomers that are small enough to go into the individual cells, remember then, through the help of circulation, those nutrients will get distributed into the body cavities, which will then be available to the individual cells within our bodies. And so that's really what we're going to be looking at then, is how we do that. How do we break down the larger food particles? What are the structures in our body that can digest? And then we'll see the distribution. We already kind of saw with the circulatory system, how the circulatory system can distribute that around, right? So we are talking about digestion is breaking down the food nutrients into their monomers and then having to absorb them into the circulatory system, right? So this is the job of our digestive system. It does these functions right here. So remember, I mentioned before the different types of nutrients that we need. We're going to have an enzyme that can process that food and break it down. Okay, and so really what enzymes do, this is part of what's called chemical digestion. And so they actually break the molecular bonds between the polymers, between those larger things. Okay. So again, enzymes are going to be specific to what we digest. And so we'll talk about that as we get into the different parts of the digestive system. Okay. And then again, those products of digestion need to be absorbed across plasma membranes. So they have to we're going to digest in a cavity in our body. That's the organ. And then the nutrients are going to be absorbed across membranes to get inside of individual cells. Okay, and the things that we eat that are minerals, like iodine and other electrolytes, vitamins, potassium, sodium, vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin A, those things don't need digestion. They're already small enough to just move across cell membranes. So we won't see any enzymes for things like that. Okay. So I really already kind of mentioned two types of digestion right now. So there was intracellular, and we saw that. Here's our paramecium again. Our paramecium, our single-celled organisms can do this. They bring the food inside of the cell, and then there might be some extra digestion to help bring those small particles, make those small particles even smaller. But then they're already inside the cell, so there's no distribution problem going on, right? However, there's a limit when you're an intracellular digester. Intra means within, cellular, the cell, right? So if you're an intracellular digester and you're a very small cell, cells are very small. We already know that from the surface area to volume ratio, right? So you're limited to very small particles of food. So you can only digest, bring in very small particles of food, right? So tiny bits are phagocytized. That's the process of bringing the food inside of the body, inside of the cell body, I should say. And then they don't have a mechanism for storing food. Okay, so they pretty much have to continuously eat and keep bringing the nutrients they need inside of their body. Okay, as opposed to what's called extracellular digestion. Okay, extracellular means outside of the cell. Okay, so food will be digested not within a cell, but outside of it. Once the nutrients are broken down small enough, then they'll be brought inside of the cell. Okay, so we saw this with fungi. Remember fungus, the hyphae, each individual hyphae can release enzymes to the external environment, and they're usually over a piece of food, and then it starts to break the food down, and they absorb the nutrients as it breaks down. So fungi, which are again composed of hyphae, they can eat something like an orange, a big orange. They don't have to bring it inside of their cell. Okay, the rest of us, we create cavities in our body, right? So that cavity, we can ingest large chunks of food. Again, still it can't be so large that we can't get it into our mouth and things, but relatively large compared to what a single cell could bring in, right? And then the cells that line that cavity excrete the enzymes, so therefore the interior of the cells are protected from the enzymes. Okay, and therefore, again, we can consume larger foods. So the simplest form of an extracellular digester is the gastrovascular cavity, right? But even before that, I forgot I threw this slide in here. Even before that, remember our first animal that we looked at were the sponges. And remember, sponges don't have a specialized digestive system. So if you can recall, along the inside lining of the sponge, which was called the spongiocele, remember that they have those choanocyte cells that line the inside. And so remember, water is brought in through the pores and kind of sucked through, and it's bringing the small particles of food with them. Okay, and the little flagellum of each choanocyte, they're kind of wiggling, and they're help create that water current. Okay, and then all the little food particles get trapped in the collar, right? There's the collar you can see over on the right side at the individual choanocyte there. The collar, remember, can create mucus along there, and that traps the food particles. Okay, and so the blue arrows are showing the water flowing between the collar, between those extensions of the collar. And the food particles get trapped there. And then the cell itself, the choanocyte, the cell body, then can phagocytize the food. It means it's a form of exocytosis, bringing those particles into the cell itself, where there's intracellular digestion going on there. Okay, it can break that down a little bit. And then it can pass it on to an adjacent cell. So there's an amoebocyte, and also one that's part of its body. There's an amoebocyte, and so it can then distribute the nutrients that way, right? But very limited in what it can do. Okay. So in the sponges, we saw, again, intracellular digestion. So the first extracellular digestion we see in cnidarians, and then also the flatworms. So this is with the gastrovascular cavity. I'll blow that up for you again. Right. So within the cavity, it's lined by cells that excrete enzymes into that cavity. Okay. And so again, they can use, in the case of the cnidarians, they can use their tentacles to capture small aquatic animals. And so they get caught there, and they can, remember, they can contract those tentacles toward their mouth and bring the food inside. And then again, the cells lining the cavity can excrete enzymes. You can see the little red dots there, um, into the gastrovascular cavity, which will then break down um, the food that was brought inside. So here you can see that actually is eating a little crustacean called a water daphnia. And so it's eating a bigger piece of food. It's actually eating a small little animal, but it can break that down inside. And then once the materials are broken down, then each of the cells lining the gastrovascular cavity can phagocytize the food, absorb it, and again, it can, the water circulating throughout that gastrovascular cavity can really distribute those food particles all around. So the cells all around lining that cavity can absorb the food molecules that are needed. And sometimes once it does absorb and phagocytize the food particles, then there's a combination of intracellular digestion. So intracellular digestion can continue to take place. And then anything that did not get digested will be expelled throughout the mouth. So there's only one opening. There's the mouth that brings in food, and it also expels the waste. And that's usually through contractions of the body. Okay. Um, Also very similar to that is the flatworm. Remember, the flatworm, it doesn't have a coelom. This is acoelomate, but it does have a digestive cavity in there. It's also called a gastrovascular cavity. So the flatworm, like planaria and things, yeah, they have, you can see down lower, their mouth isn't where you think it is. It's not on their head. It's actually a little bit lower. And what they can do is they can actually extend their pharynx outside of their body. That's almost like their throat. They extend it outside of their mouth, and they can secrete digestive enzymes onto their prey. So they do a little bit of extracellular digestion that way. Then they can ingest smaller particles through the pharynx into the gastrovascular cavity. And then that's where enzymes continue digestion throughout the gastrovascular cavity. And you can see how it branches throughout their body. And then also they have cells lining the cavity. Then those cells can phagocytize the partially digested food that happened within the cavity, bring it inside of each cell, and then again we get a little combination of intracellular digestion going on there. And then the cells, through diffusion across one cell to another, can distribute the particles. But you can see with the gastrovascular cavity branching throughout the body of the organism, of the flatworm, that's how food particles can also get distributed all throughout. Okay, and then just like we saw before with the cnidarian, any products that aren't digested will actually get expelled through the mouth as well. Okay, and so this is called, when there's one opening to the gut, one opening to the digestive system, we refer to that as an incomplete gut. Incomplete. Okay, what we're going to see now is that most digestive systems of animals have two openings, and that's referred to as a complete gut. So you have a mouth on one end and an anus at the other end. So the mouth is where food enters, and it goes throughout the tube getting processed, and anything that can't be used as nutrients gets expelled out the other end as waste. So this is a little more efficient. Okay. And so this is kind of a tube within a tube body plan. So what you're seeing here is an earthworm, one of the annelids. And here when we see this complete gut start to form. And you're already starting to see that along the tube there are specialized regions that can process the food in a little different way. Okay. Here's a kind of elongated view of a more complex digestive system, just to show the tubular structure. And in more complex organisms like invertebrates, we refer to it as the gastrointestinal tract or the GI tract, right? And so again, it's a tube within the body. So the opening is at the mouth, and the tube is extended from the mouth down the esophagus into the stomach, which then the tube becomes the small intestines, right? And so that can be the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And then the tube differentiates into the large intestines, to the rectum, and then the opening to the external environment to expel the waste is the anus, right? So a single elongated tube, you've got the entry and exit ends. Along the way, throughout lining the entire tube, are epithelial cells, and they specialize in those different regions that are labeled there. They might synthesize different digestive enzymes. They might have to secrete hormones, because hormones are going to be used to hormones are going to be used to coordinate all of these organs to one another, and then also to transport the digested material all the way throughout this tube. Okay, and then the absorption will take place in specialized regions of the tube, right? And then in other areas, so I mentioned we have secretions, we might need that from accessory organs. So they're not a part of the tube, but they're connected to it. Like you see the pancreas there. Later on, we're going to see the liver. They didn't draw it in this picture here. Makes it a much more complex organ system, but it's going to become much more efficient. So let's look at it from the point of view of a vertebrate, like a human. Okay. Again, the alimentary canal itself is the tube where food travels through. And then you have accessory organs that helps to either process the food, like the tongue and the teeth, or to secrete the important enzymes that are needed. Salivary glands, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. So I'm going to end the video here. And what we're going to do is I'll start a part 2 of this video, and we'll launch into the vertebrate digestive systems. All right, thanks everybody.